Stop right there. Nobody survives the forbidden forest after midnight. The desperate warning echoed through the rain, just as Alpha King Ethan Blackwood pulled his horse to a halt beneath towering pine trees whipped by the violent storm. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, revealing broken branches scattered over the muddy trail, while thunder rolled through the mountains surrounding Blackwood Kingdom. Ethan had spent the evening inspecting the northern border after reports of dangerous landslides, expecting nothing more than damaged roads and frightened villagers. Instead, he found something no king could have imagined. Beneath the twisted roots of an ancient oak tree lay a young woman dressed in a weather-worn ivory cloak, completely unconscious, yet strangely untouched by the chaos surrounding her. Rain poured across the forest floor, but the ground around her remained almost unnaturally calm, as though the storm itself refused to come any closer. Ethan immediately dismounted and carefully approached without lowering his guard. The forbidden forest had been surrounded by legends for generations. Travelers claimed it hid forgotten secrets of the royal family, while older villagers whispered that fate often revealed itself beneath those ancient trees. Ethan had never believed every story he heard, but standing there in the middle of the storm, he could not ignore the strange feeling that this meeting had been waiting for him long before either of them had taken their first breath. Kneeling beside the young woman, he noticed her steady breathing and peaceful expression despite the freezing rain. She looked no older than 23 or 24. Long chestnut hair framed her pale face, and her hands, although chilled by the cold, showed none of the rough marks expected from someone who had wandered through the wilderness for days. As Ethan gently brushed a strand of wet hair away from her face, something beneath her cloak caught his attention. Hanging from a delicate silver chain rested an elegant pendant shaped like a rising moon surrounded by tiny engraved lilies. His heartbeat slowed. He had seen that symbol only once before. Years earlier, as a young prince, he had stood beside his father inside the royal hall, where portraits of every ruler lined the walls. Above the portrait of the late queen had been the exact same royal crest, created exclusively for the direct bloodline of the kingdom. It had disappeared from public view after the mysterious loss of the infant princess more than 20 years earlier. No ordinary citizen possessed that emblem. No noble family was permitted to copy it. Ethan carefully lifted the pendant, studying every tiny detail illuminated by another flash of lightning. It was genuine. Before he could gather his thoughts, the young woman stirred slightly, her lips barely moving as though she were trying to remember something hidden beyond reach. In a faint whisper almost carried away by the wind, she spoke only one word. Home. Then silence returned. Ethan looked toward the endless darkness stretching between the ancient trees. Whoever this woman was, she had not appeared inside the forbidden forest by accident. If the pendant truly belonged to the royal bloodline, then the greatest mystery in Blackwood Kingdom had just taken its first breath after more than 2 decades of silence. And somewhere beyond the storm, someone might already be searching for the secret she carried without even remembering who she truly was. Morning sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds as Alpha King Ethan Blackwood returned to Blackwood Palace carrying the mysterious young woman carefully wrapped in a warm wool blanket. The palace gates opened immediately when the royal guards recognized their king, but confusion spread quickly among the attendants as they realized he was bringing home an unconscious stranger from the forbidden forest. Ethan ignored the curious whispers and instructed the palace physician to prepare the eastern guest chamber overlooking the royal gardens, a peaceful room filled with natural light where recovering visitors often rested. Dr. Samuel Whitmore arrived within minutes and carefully examined the young woman while Ethan remained nearby, quietly studying the unusual silver pendant that rested against her neck. After completing his examination, the physician looked toward the king with cautious reassurance. She is exhausted and mildly dehydrated, but there are no serious injuries. Physically, she should recover soon. Ethan nodded with relief, yet the questions filling his mind had only grown heavier. He carefully described the royal emblem engraved upon the pendant, but Dr. Whitmore immediately recognized the symbol as well. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "that crest has not appeared inside this palace since the disappearance of the infant princess more than 20 years ago." Ethan glanced once more toward the sleeping young woman. The possibility seemed almost impossible to believe, yet he could not dismiss it. Several hours later, the sunlight warmed the elegant guest chamber as birds sang beyond the open windows overlooking blooming gardens. The young woman slowly opened her eyes, blinking at the unfamiliar surroundings before quietly sitting upright. Confusion immediately filled her expression as she looked around the beautifully decorated room. Ethan entered moments later, carrying a tray with warm tea and fresh bread prepared by the palace kitchen. He approached slowly so she would not feel frightened. "You are safe," he said gently. "You were found unconscious in the forbidden forest." She looked into his eyes with sincere gratitude, but her confusion only deepened. "Where am I?" she asked quietly. "Blackwood Palace," Ethan answered. She repeated the words softly as though hearing them for the first time. Then Ethan asked the simplest question of all. "What is your name?" Silence settled across the room. The young woman searched desperately through her memories, closing her eyes as though hoping familiar images would suddenly appear. Instead, she found only darkness. Her breathing became unsteady before she finally whispered, "I do not know." Ethan remained calm, offering reassurance instead of pressure. "Do you remember your family?" She slowly shook her head. "Your home." Another gentle shake of her head followed. The only memory she could recall was waking briefly in the middle of the storm before everything disappeared once again. Seeing the fear growing in her eyes, Ethan decided not to ask any more questions. "Until your memories return," he said kindly, "you will remain here as our honored guest." Because she could remember nothing about herself, Ethan suggested a temporary name inspired by the peaceful emerald ivy climbing the palace walls outside her window. "Would Emily be acceptable until you remember your true name?" She smiled faintly for the first time. "Emily," she repeated quietly, as though testing how it sounded. Before leaving the room, Ethan noticed her gaze drifting toward the silver pendant resting against her neck. She touched it instinctively, although she clearly had no memory of where it came from. Neither of them realized that beyond the palace walls, an elderly woman living in a distant village had spent more than 2 decades waiting for the day she would see that royal emblem again, believing it was the final key to a secret powerful enough to change the future of the entire kingdom. The following morning brought clear blue skies over Blackwood Palace, and for the first time since awakening inside the eastern guest chamber, Emily stepped outside to explore the magnificent royal gardens. The fragrance of blooming roses drifted gently through the spring air, while marble fountains reflected bright sunlight across carefully trimmed hedges. Everything around her felt strangely familiar, yet she could not explain why. She slowly walked along a winding stone path lined with white lilies, instinctively reaching out to brush her fingertips across the delicate petals. A quiet feeling settled deep within her heart, as though she had walked this very path long ago. From a nearby terrace, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood watched discreetly without disturbing her peaceful moment. He had instructed the palace attendants not to overwhelm Emily with questions, believing patience offered a better chance for her memories to return than pressure ever could. As she wandered through the gardens, an elderly palace housekeeper named Eleanor Brooks approached carrying a basket filled with freshly cut flowers for the royal chapel. Eleanor had faithfully served 3 generations of the royal family and knew every corner of the palace better than anyone still living. She greeted Emily with a warm smile before suddenly freezing in place. Emily had begun softly humming a gentle lullaby without even realizing it. The simple melody drifted through the quiet garden, causing Eleanor's hands to tremble so noticeably that several flowers slipped from her basket onto the stone pathway. Tears slowly filled the elderly woman's eyes. More than 20 years had passed since she had last heard that melody, yet she recognized every note immediately. It had been the private lullaby Queen Isabella sang only to her infant daughter every evening inside the royal nursery. The song had never been performed during public ceremonies, never written into royal records, and never taught outside the immediate household. Eleanor carefully gathered the fallen flowers while trying to steady her emotions. Emily looked at her with gentle concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked kindly. Eleanor forced a reassuring smile, unwilling to frighten the young woman before knowing the truth. "Yes, my dear," she answered softly. "You simply reminded me of someone I once knew a very long time ago." After returning to her duties, Eleanor hurried directly toward the private office of Alpha King Ethan. Closing the heavy wooden door behind her, She spoke with unusual urgency. "Your Majesty, there is something you must hear." Ethan immediately noticed the emotion in her voice and invited her to sit, but she remained standing. The young woman in the garden was humming the Queen's lullaby. Ethan frowned thoughtfully. Could she have heard it somewhere else? Eleanor slowly shook her head. Impossible. Her Majesty composed that melody herself after the princess was born. Only a handful of people ever heard it. Ethan silently considered everything that had happened since discovering Emily inside the Forbidden Forest. The royal pendant, her mysterious appearance, her complete loss of memory, now the forgotten lullaby. Each clue seemed small on its own, yet together they formed a pattern too remarkable to ignore. Later that afternoon, Emily wandered into the oldest wing of the palace, following an unexplainable feeling that drew her toward a long locked hallway. She stopped before an elegant carved wooden door she had never seen before and gently rested her hand against its surface. The moment her fingertips touched the ancient wood, a vivid image flashed through her mind. She saw warm candlelight, heard a woman singing softly, and felt herself being lifted into loving arms before the vision disappeared as quickly as it had come. Emily stepped back, breathing deeply as tears unexpectedly filled her eyes. She still could not remember who she was, but somewhere beyond the walls of Blackwood Palace, the first forgotten pieces of her past had finally begun searching for their way home. The quiet rhythm of palace life changed only 2 days after Emily's mysterious arrival. Word had quietly spread through Blackwood Palace that the Alpha King had rescued an unknown young woman from the Forbidden Forest, and curiosity soon reached the royal council. On a cool spring morning, Ethan Blackwood entered the council chamber where the kingdom's highest advisors had already gathered around the long oak table. Towering stained glass windows filled the room with colorful light, yet the atmosphere felt unusually tense. Lord Victor Hawthorne, the kingdom's most influential senior advisor, rose slowly from his chair before Ethan had even taken his seat. His expression remained respectful, but his eyes revealed unmistakable concern. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "the council has learned about the young woman currently residing inside the palace. We believe allowing an unidentified stranger to remain within the royal residence creates unnecessary uncertainty." Ethan calmly folded his hands together. "She is recovering from memory loss and has harmed no one." Lord Hawthorne nodded politely. "That may be true. However, no one knows where she came from or why she appeared inside the Forbidden Forest carrying an object connected to the royal family. Until her identity is confirmed, she should be moved elsewhere." Several council members quietly agreed, although others remained silent, watching Ethan's reaction. The Alpha King answered without raising his voice. "She will remain under my protection until the truth is discovered. Compassion is not weakness, and abandoning someone who cannot even remember her own name is not the kind of kingdom we serve." The discussion ended without further argument, but as the council members departed, Ethan noticed Lord Hawthorne pause briefly beside one of the palace windows overlooking the gardens. The older man's calm expression disappeared for only an instant, replaced by something far more difficult to understand. It was not anger. It looked almost like fear. Later that afternoon, Emily continued exploring the quieter wings of the palace while Eleanor Brooks accompanied her through long corridors decorated with portraits of generations of royal ancestors. Emily paused before each painting with quiet curiosity, feeling drawn toward faces she had never knowingly seen before. As they entered an older gallery rarely visited by guests, her attention immediately settled upon a faded portrait of Queen Isabella holding a small infant wrapped in ivory silk. Emily stepped closer without speaking. She could not explain why tears suddenly formed in her eyes. The Queen's gentle smile stirred a warmth she could not place, while the embroidered blanket surrounding the child seemed strangely familiar. Eleanor watched silently, noticing that Emily instinctively reached toward the painted silver pendant resting around the infant's neck. It matched the one Emily wore perfectly. Before either woman could speak, footsteps echoed through the corridor. Ethan had arrived after hearing from a palace attendant that Emily had wandered into the royal gallery. He followed her gaze toward the portrait and immediately recognized the significance of what she was seeing. Emily turned toward him with quiet uncertainty. "Why does this painting feel like I have known it my entire life?" she whispered. Ethan searched for the right answer, but found none that would not burden her with possibilities before certainty existed. Perhaps memories sometimes recognize places before our minds do, he replied gently. Emily looked once more at the portrait before lowering her eyes to the silver pendant resting against her heart. At that same moment, hidden behind the partially open gallery door, Lord Victor Hawthorne silently observed everything. As his eyes settled upon the matching royal emblem, his face slowly lost its color. Without allowing anyone to notice his presence, he quietly turned away, fully aware that if Emily's forgotten past continued returning piece by piece, a secret buried for more than 20 years might soon become impossible to hide. That evening, long after most of Blackwood Palace had fallen silent, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood carried a single lantern into the oldest section of the royal archives, determined to answer the questions that had followed him since discovering Emily in the Forbidden Forest. Dust drifted through narrow beams of golden light as he unlocked a heavy oak door that had not been opened in years. Shelves filled with leather-bound records stretched from floor to ceiling, preserving centuries of royal history. Ethan had visited the archives many times during his reign, but never with a mystery that felt so deeply personal. He carefully removed a collection of documents labeled with the year the infant princess had disappeared. At first, the official reports appeared straightforward. According to the royal record, the princess had vanished during a violent storm while the royal family traveled between two mountain estates. Search parties had spent months exploring forests, rivers, and neighboring territories, yet no trace of the child had ever been found. The kingdom eventually accepted the heartbreaking conclusion that she had been lost forever. Still, something about the documents immediately felt incomplete. Several pages contained unusual gaps where witness statements should have appeared. Entire sections had been rewritten in noticeably different handwriting. Even the dates on several reports no longer matched one another. Ethan slowly compared one record against another until he discovered a faded inventory list mentioning sealed testimony from palace guards assigned to protect the royal carriage that night. The testimony itself was missing. Instead, only a note remained stating that the original statements had been relocated under direct authority of the Royal Council more than 20 years earlier. Ethan frowned thoughtfully. Official records were never altered without extraordinary reason. Someone had deliberately removed important pieces of the story. Meanwhile, Emily remained unable to sleep. Drawn by another quiet feeling she could not explain, she wandered into the palace music room, where a grand piano rested beneath tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. She gently touched the polished keys, uncertain why the instrument seemed so familiar. Without thinking, her fingers began playing the same gentle lullaby Eleanor Brooks had recognized only days before. The melody flowed naturally, each note arriving without effort, as though her hands remembered what her mind had forgotten. Ethan, returning from the archives, paused outside the open doorway when he heard the music. He quietly watched without interrupting. As the final notes faded into silence, Emily looked down at her hands with tears filling her eyes. "I do not understand," she whispered. "I cannot remember my own name, but somehow I remember this." Ethan stepped into the room with calm reassurance. Sometimes the heart protects memories long before the mind can find them again. Emily offered a faint smile, though uncertainty remained in her eyes. "Do you think I truly belong here?" she asked softly. Ethan answered honestly. "I think this palace remembers you, even if you do not remember it yet." At that very moment, in another wing of the palace, Lord Victor Hawthorne stood alone inside his private study, staring at an old wooden box hidden behind a locked cabinet. After a long hesitation, he slowly opened it. Inside rested a small piece of faded ivory fabric embroidered with the same royal crest hanging around Emily's neck. His expression grew pale as forgotten memories returned with painful clarity. Quietly closing the box once again, he realized the Alpha King had already begun uncovering truths that should have remained buried forever, and unless something changed soon, the greatest secret in the history of Blackwood Kingdom was preparing to reveal itself at last. The following morning arrived with gentle sunlight spilling across Blackwood Palace, yet Emily could not escape the growing feeling that every hallway, every garden, and every quiet corner of the castle awakened something hidden deep inside her heart. After breakfast, Eleanor Brooks suggested they visit the palace chapel, explaining that it had remained almost unchanged for decades. Emily accepted with quiet curiosity. As they entered the peaceful stone sanctuary, colorful light streamed through stained glass windows, filling the room with warm shades of blue, gold, and crimson. The air carried the faint fragrance of old wood and fresh lilies resting beside the altar. Emily slowly walked down the center aisle, her footsteps almost instinctively following a familiar rhythm she could not explain. When she reached the front of the chapel, she gently placed her hand upon a carved wooden railing. Suddenly, another memory flashed before her eyes. She saw herself as a small child reaching toward bright stained glass, while a woman wearing a royal gown smiled warmly beside her. The vision disappeared almost immediately, leaving Emily standing silently with tears forming once again. Eleanor carefully supported her arm. "Did you remember something?" she asked softly. Emily nodded uncertainly. "Only pieces," she whispered. "A woman with kind eyes. She was holding my hand. I think she was singing." Eleanor quietly closed her eyes because the description matched Queen Isabella perfectly. Later that afternoon, Ethan Blackwood invited Emily to join him for a walk through the oldest courtyard of the palace, where ancient oak trees shaded a peaceful stone pathway leading toward the former royal nursery. The building had remained closed since the princess disappeared, preserved exactly as it had been many years before. Ethan had never entered after becoming king, believing some memories deserved respectful silence. Yet today something encouraged him to unlock the weathered wooden door. Dust floated gently through the sunlight as they stepped inside. The nursery remained beautifully preserved. An elegant cradle rested near the window. Shelves held handcrafted wooden toys, embroidered blankets, and faded storybooks carefully protected from time. Emily slowly wandered through the room without speaking. Her eyes settled upon a small wooden rocking horse standing near the fireplace. Almost without thinking, she reached down and touched its polished handle. Another vivid memory flooded her mind. She heard joyful laughter, felt herself rocking gently while a man lifted her into the air, and saw the silver pendant resting against a tiny ivory dress. This time the memory lasted longer before slowly fading away. Emily stepped backward, overwhelmed by emotion but no longer frightened. Ethan quietly remained beside her, allowing the silence to speak. "I know this room," she finally whispered. "I cannot explain how, but I know it." Ethan looked around the nursery with growing certainty. Every new memory pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. Before either of them could continue, Captain Daniel Mercer entered carrying a small leather case recently recovered from a forgotten storage chamber beneath the archives. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "our archivists found this hidden inside an old cabinet sealed more than 20 years ago." Ethan carefully opened the case. Inside rested a faded royal birth record bearing the official crest of Blackwood Kingdom. Although time had damaged several sections, one detail remained perfectly visible. Attached to the document was a delicate sketch of the infant princess wearing a silver pendant shaped like a rising moon surrounded by tiny engraved lilies, identical in every detail to the one resting around Emily's neck. Ethan slowly raised his eyes toward her. Emily looked down at the pendant with trembling hands, realizing that the answers she had searched for were no longer hidden somewhere beyond the palace walls. They had been waiting for her inside the kingdom all along, and the truth now stood only one final step away from changing both of their lives forever. That evening, after the discovery inside the abandoned royal nursery, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood decided that the growing collection of clues could no longer be ignored. Yet instead of announcing his suspicions to the royal council, he chose absolute secrecy. Too many questions remained unanswered, and he refused to expose Emily to political speculation before the truth could be proven beyond doubt. As twilight settled over Blackwood Palace, Ethan invited only Captain Daniel Mercer and Eleanor Brooks to meet him inside the oldest archive chamber beneath the western tower. Resting upon the large oak table were the silver pendant, the faded royal birth record, copies of the altered council reports, and sketches recovered from forgotten storage rooms. Every piece pointed toward the same astonishing possibility. Ethan carefully studied each document before speaking. If Emily truly is the lost princess, someone deliberately erased her from history. Daniel nodded slowly. The missing witness statements were not misplaced. They were removed. Eleanor looked toward the pendant with tears quietly filling her eyes. And someone believed the truth should never be found. Ethan remained silent for several moments. The deeper he investigated, the clearer one fact became. The disappearance had not been a simple tragedy. Someone inside the palace had carefully hidden evidence for more than 2 decades. Meanwhile, Emily wandered alone through the palace gardens beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. She carried the silver pendant in her hand, gently tracing its engraved lilies while searching for memories that remained just beyond reach. Without realizing where her feet were leading, she arrived before an ancient stone gazebo overlooking the northern lake. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and suddenly another forgotten image appeared inside her mind. She saw herself as a little girl running happily through the same garden while a woman in a white royal gown laughed softly nearby. Then another figure entered the memory, an elderly knight kneeling before her with a warm smile as he presented a tiny carved wooden swan. Emily gasped quietly as the vision disappeared. It was the clearest memory she had experienced yet. She immediately returned to the palace and described every detail to Ethan. As she mentioned the carved wooden swan, Eleanor covered her mouth in disbelief. There was only one person who carved toys like that, she whispered. Sir Thomas Grayson, captain of the Royal Guard. He protected the princess every single day before she disappeared. Ethan immediately ordered the palace records concerning Sir Thomas to be retrieved. Less than an hour later, Daniel returned carrying an old service ledger. According to the official record, Sir Thomas had resigned only 3 days after the princess vanished and had quietly settled in a small mountain village beyond the Eastern Valley. No further interviews had ever been recorded. Ethan looked toward Daniel with growing determination. Why would the captain responsible for protecting the royal child disappear from history immediately afterward? Daniel answered honestly. Perhaps because nobody wanted to hear what he knew. Before dawn the following morning, Ethan decided they would travel to the mountain village themselves. He trusted very few people with the investigation now, and every new discovery suggested the truth had been hidden intentionally rather than forgotten by time. As Emily prepared for the journey, she paused once more beside the nursery window, feeling an unexplainable certainty growing inside her heart. She still could not remember her real name. But for the first time, she believed those missing memories were no longer waiting somewhere in the distant past. They were waiting for someone who had protected her long ago. And if Sir Thomas Grayson was still alive, he might finally reveal the secret that had shaped the destiny of the entire kingdom for more than 20 years. The first light of dawn stretched across the eastern mountains as Alpha King Ethan Blackwood, Emily, Captain Daniel Mercer, and Eleanor Brooks quietly departed Blackwood Palace. Their destination was a peaceful village hidden beyond the pine forests where Sir Thomas Grayson had reportedly lived in seclusion since leaving the Royal Guard more than 20 years earlier. Ethan intentionally traveled with only a small escort, determined to keep the investigation away from curious eyes inside the palace. The journey lasted several hours, winding through rolling green hills, clear streams, and quiet farming communities untouched by royal politics. Throughout the ride, Emily found herself strangely comforted by the familiar landscapes. Every distant mountain and every narrow woodland trail stirred quiet emotions she still could not fully explain. Shortly before noon, they arrived at a modest stone cottage overlooking a peaceful meadow filled with wildflowers. An elderly man with silver hair stood outside repairing a wooden fence. Although age had slowed his movements, his posture still reflected the discipline of a lifelong soldier. As Ethan approached, the old man immediately bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," Sir Thomas said warmly. Ethan gently raised him back to his feet. "Today I have come not as your king, but as a man searching for the truth." Sir Thomas welcomed everyone inside. The cottage was simple, yet carefully maintained. Wooden carvings decorated the shelves, including several graceful swans identical to the one Emily had remembered. The moment her eyes settled upon them, another powerful memory surfaced. She remembered laughing while an older knight handed her the tiny carved bird before lifting her into his arms. Tears quietly filled her eyes. Sir Thomas looked toward Emily with growing astonishment. For several long moments he could not speak. Finally, his voice trembled with emotion. "Those eyes," he whispered. They are exactly like Queen Isabella's. Ethan carefully placed the silver pendant and the faded birth record upon the wooden table. We believe she may be the lost princess, he said quietly. We need to know everything you remember. Sir Thomas slowly closed his eyes before taking a deep breath. I have carried this burden every day for more than 20 years, he admitted. On the night the princess disappeared, our royal carriage was forced to stop during a violent storm. While everyone searched for shelter, I was entrusted with protecting the infant princess. Then a loyal palace maid named Margaret Collins arrived carrying urgent instructions from the queen herself. She told me the royal family feared a conspiracy inside the palace. The queen believed someone powerful intended to eliminate the royal bloodline. She begged me to help save the child by allowing Margaret to secretly take the princess away until it was safe. Emily listened in complete silence as forgotten emotions slowly returned. Sir Thomas continued, his voice filled with regret. I agreed because I trusted the queen completely. Margaret promised she would hide the child where no one could find her. Before leaving, the queen removed the royal pendant from her own neck and placed it around the baby's neck so the truth could one day be proven. Eleanor quietly wiped away tears because every detail matched the memories she still carried from those years. Ethan looked toward Emily, whose hands trembled as she held the silver pendant against her heart. The missing pieces were finally falling into place. Margaret Collins had not kidnapped the princess. She had protected her. Yet one question still remained unanswered. If the queen had trusted only a handful of people with such an extraordinary secret, who inside Blackwood Palace had forced her to make such a desperate decision in the first place? And why had that hidden threat remained powerful enough to erase the truth for more than 2 decades? The journey back to Blackwood Palace was filled with thoughtful silence. Every mile carried Alpha King Ethan Blackwood, Emily, Captain Daniel Mercer, and Eleanor Brooks closer to a truth that no longer seemed impossible. Sir Thomas Grayson's testimony had answered many questions, yet it had also uncovered an even greater mystery. Someone inside the royal court had created such fear that Queen Isabella had willingly separated from her own daughter to save her life. Ethan understood that recovering Emily's identity was only half the battle. Discovering who had benefited from the princess's disappearance remained equally important. Upon returning to the palace that evening, Ethan ordered every recovered document, witness statement, and historical record to be secured inside his private study. No member of the royal council was informed of the latest discoveries. Only the small group that had traveled together knew the full story. Emily remained quiet as she stood beside the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The memories she had regained no longer felt like distant dreams. They carried warmth, voices, and faces that slowly became clearer each day. Although she still could not remember every detail of her childhood, she no longer questioned whether she truly belonged to Blackwood Kingdom. Deep within her heart, certainty had begun replacing confusion. The following morning, Ethan requested access to several sealed financial ledgers and council correspondence from the years surrounding the princess's disappearance. Hours passed as he carefully examined page after page. Most records appeared ordinary until one particular ledger revealed an unusual pattern. Shortly after the infant princess vanished, enormous sums from the royal treasury had quietly been redirected toward expanding the authority of the royal council. Several influential advisors had received new estates, additional privileges, and greater political influence during the same period. Ethan slowly placed the ledger beside the altered witness reports. The timing could not be ignored. Daniel Mercer studied the documents with growing concern. Someone gained tremendous power after the princess disappeared, he observed. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. If the rightful heir vanished, the balance inside the kingdom changed overnight. Before either man could continue, Eleanor entered carrying another unexpected discovery. While organizing forgotten records beneath the palace chapel, she had uncovered an old ceremonial guest register signed by Queen Isabella only days before the princess disappeared. Tucked between 2 faded pages rested a handwritten letter addressed not to the king, but to Margaret Collins. Ethan carefully unfolded the fragile parchment. The queen's elegant handwriting remained remarkably clear despite the passing years. She wrote that if danger ever reached the royal nursery, Margaret must protect the child at any cost, because there was no longer safety within the palace walls. She also wrote one final sentence that caused everyone in the room to fall completely silent. Trust only those whose loyalty has never been purchased by ambition. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. The queen herself had known that ambition, not foreign enemies, threatened her family. At that same hour, inside another wing of Blackwood Palace, Lord Victor Hawthorne quietly entered the archive office expecting to retrieve several old council records before anyone noticed they were missing. Instead, he discovered empty shelves where the documents had once been stored. His expression changed instantly. He realized someone had already begun following the same trail he had spent decades trying to erase. Standing alone in the silent archive, he understood that time was no longer on his side. The carefully hidden history of Blackwood Kingdom was beginning to surface piece by piece, and once the Royal Council gathered for its next formal session, the truth would no longer remain buried inside forgotten records. It would stand before the entire kingdom, waiting for those responsible to answer questions that had remained silent for more than 20 years. The morning of the Royal Council assembly arrived beneath clear skies, yet an unmistakable feeling of anticipation settled across Blackwood Palace. Noble families, senior advisors, military commanders, and respected elders gathered inside the Grand Council chamber after receiving Alpha King Ethan Blackwood's unexpected invitation to attend a special session. No official agenda had been announced, causing quiet conversations to spread throughout the magnificent hall. Emily remained inside a private chamber overlooking the palace gardens, dressed in a graceful ivory gown chosen by Eleanor Brooks. Although elegant, the clothing reflected dignity rather than luxury. She stood before the window holding the silver pendant in her hand, breathing slowly as she prepared herself for whatever truth awaited beyond the chamber doors. Ethan entered quietly and offered a reassuring smile. "Today is not about proving your worth," he said gently. "It is about allowing the truth to speak for itself." Emily looked toward him with calm determination. "Whatever the truth may be, I am ready to hear it." Together they walked toward the council chamber, where every seat had already been filled. As Ethan entered, the room immediately fell silent. Lord Victor Hawthorne maintained his usual composed expression, although his hands rested unusually still upon the polished wooden table before him. Ethan took his place at the front of the chamber without haste. "Today," he began, "we are not meeting to debate rumors. We are here to examine facts that belong to the history of this kingdom." He signaled to Captain Daniel Mercer, who carefully placed several items upon the central table. First came the faded royal birth record recovered from the sealed archive. Next came the handwritten letter from Queen Isabella addressed to Margaret Collins. Then the altered council reports, the missing financial ledgers, and finally the silver pendant engraved with the royal crest. Ethan explained each document patiently, allowing every member of the council to examine the evidence for themselves. Eleanor Brooks then stepped forward and described the private lullaby that only Queen Isabella had ever sung to her infant daughter. Sir Thomas Grayson's sworn written testimony was read aloud, explaining how Margaret Collins had protected the child under the Queen's direct instruction after fears of an internal conspiracy threatened the royal family. The chamber remained completely silent as every piece of evidence connected naturally with the next. Ethan finally invited Emily to step forward. She approached calmly, her expression steady despite the attention of the entire assembly. Without prompting, she softly sang the familiar lullaby that had returned through her memories. Several elderly palace servants quietly lowered their heads as tears formed in their eyes. They recognized the melody immediately. Ethan looked across the chamber before speaking once more. "The evidence presented today is consistent, independently supported, and preserved across multiple sources separated by more than 20 years. Every surviving witness, every recovered document, and every royal symbol leads to one conclusion." He turned toward Emily with quiet respect. "This young woman is the lost princess of Blackwood Kingdom." A wave of astonished whispers spread throughout the chamber. Some council members looked toward the recovered records with disbelief, while others silently accepted what the evidence clearly demonstrated. Lord Victor Hawthorne remained seated, his face noticeably pale as Ethan calmly shifted his attention toward the council table once more. "The identity of the princess has now been established," Ethan said. Our next responsibility is to determine who altered the royal records, removed sworn testimony, and allowed the truth to remain hidden for more than 2 decades. At that moment, every eye inside the chamber slowly turned toward the senior advisors, because for the first time in many years, the kingdom was no longer asking whether the princess had survived. It was asking who had benefited from making the entire kingdom believe she had disappeared forever. The Grand Council chamber remained completely silent after Alpha King Ethan Blackwood presented the final piece of evidence. No one questioned the authenticity of the royal birth record, the Queen's handwritten letter, the sworn testimony of Sir Thomas Grayson, or the silver pendant that had remained with Emily since childhood. For the first time in more than 20 years, the kingdom stood face to face with a truth that history had almost forgotten. Ethan allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "Today is not a day for revenge," he said calmly. "It is a day for honesty, accountability, and restoration." His steady voice echoed throughout the chamber, replacing uncertainty with quiet confidence. Lord Victor Hawthorne slowly rose from his chair. The respected advisor who had served 3 kings appeared older than anyone remembered. He looked across the chamber before lowering his eyes. "Your Majesty," he began softly, "I owe this kingdom an explanation." Every member of the council listened carefully. Hawthorne admitted that after the princess disappeared, fear had spread through the palace. Rumors of political instability had convinced several senior advisors that revealing the Queen's secret plan would throw the kingdom into deeper uncertainty. Rather than continue searching publicly for the missing child, they chose to seal documents, remove testimony, and preserve the official story that the princess had been lost forever. Hawthorne admitted that he had supported those decisions, believing he was protecting the stability of the kingdom. But over the years he realized that protecting peace without protecting truth had created a different kind of injustice. "I did not seek the throne," he said honestly. "I believed silence would prevent conflict. Instead, silence became its own burden." Ethan listened carefully before answering. "History cannot be changed, but honesty can change what happens next." Several council members quietly acknowledged their own roles in allowing incomplete records to remain unquestioned for decades. The atmosphere inside the chamber slowly shifted from accusation toward responsibility. Emily stood silently beside Ethan, absorbing every word. She had spent weeks searching for her identity, imagining countless possibilities, yet hearing the truth spoken aloud brought unexpected peace rather than anger. She stepped forward and looked directly at the council. "I lost many years that I can never recover," she said gently. "But I also gained a life filled with kindness from the people who protected me. I cannot build the future by living inside yesterday." Her calm words filled the chamber with quiet reflection. Eleanor Brooks wiped away tears while Captain Daniel Mercer lowered his head respectfully. Ethan smiled with quiet pride, recognizing that Emily already carried the compassion worthy of a true princess. The council unanimously voted to restore every historical record to its original form, officially recognizing Emily as the rightful lost princess of Blackwood Kingdom. Royal historians immediately began preparing new archives that accurately recorded the Queen's sacrifice, Margaret Collins' courage, Sir Thomas Grayson's loyalty, and every witness whose testimony had finally been restored. As the formal session concluded, Ethan accompanied Emily onto the palace balcony overlooking the capital. Thousands of citizens had gathered peacefully below after hearing that an important royal announcement had taken place. Emily looked across the city with quiet wonder. Although many faces were unfamiliar, she felt an undeniable connection to the people standing below. Ethan gently spoke beside her. "You have recovered your name, your family, and your place in this kingdom. The only question remaining is not who you were. It is who you wish to become." Emily smiled softly as warm sunlight reflected from the silver pendant resting against her heart. For the first time since awakening inside Blackwood Palace without a single memory, she no longer felt like someone searching for a home. She had finally found it, and beyond the palace gardens, an entire kingdom was preparing to welcome back the princess it had unknowingly been waiting for all along. Several days after the Royal Council officially restored the historical record, Blackwood Palace felt transformed by a quiet sense of renewal. The atmosphere that had once been filled with unanswered questions had slowly given way to hope. Craftsmen carefully restored the old royal gallery, Historians worked patiently to preserve newly recovered documents, and the palace gardens blossomed beneath the warmth of late spring as though the kingdom itself had welcomed the return of long-awaited peace. Emily spent much of her time learning about the family she had lost. Eleanor Brooks shared treasured memories of Queen Isabella's kindness, while Sir Thomas Grayson remained at the palace as an honored guest, answering every question Emily gently asked about her earliest years. He described how the Queen had always carried her through the gardens at sunrise, how the King had laughed whenever the little princess reached for birds flying above the fountains, and how every servant had celebrated her first birthday beneath flowering cherry trees. Although Emily could never relive those moments, hearing them spoken aloud allowed forgotten pieces of her heart to settle into place. One quiet afternoon, Ethan Blackwood accompanied Emily to a peaceful hillside overlooking the capital. The same rolling fields stretched toward the distant mountains where she had first been found in the Forbidden Forest. They stood together beneath an ancient oak tree while a gentle breeze carried the fragrance of wildflowers across the valley. Emily looked toward the kingdom spread beneath them and smiled softly. "For so many years I believed I belonged nowhere," she admitted. "Now I understand that home is more than a place. It is the people who refuse to stop believing in you." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "And sometimes," he replied, "home waits patiently until the right moment to welcome someone back." Emily looked down at the silver pendant resting around her neck. It no longer represented a mystery. It had become a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the love that had quietly protected her even when she could not remember her own name. Back at the palace, Lord Victor Hawthorne voluntarily stepped away from his position within the royal council after publicly acknowledging the consequences of the decisions made decades earlier. Rather than leaving in disgrace, he dedicated himself to helping the royal historians recover every missing record so future generations would inherit an honest account of the kingdom's past. Ethan accepted his cooperation, believing that lasting justice required truth as well as humility. Margaret Collins, now elderly but still living peacefully in the countryside, was invited to the palace for the first time in more than 20 years. When Emily finally embraced the woman who had risked everything to protect her as an infant, neither of them could hold back their tears. Margaret gently smiled through the emotion. "I promised your mother I would keep you safe," she whispered. "Seeing you here today means I finally fulfilled that promise." Emily held her hands tightly with deep gratitude. "You gave me the chance to have this future," she answered. As evening settled across Blackwood Palace, bells echoed gently throughout the kingdom, while preparations quietly began for a special royal ceremony unlike any held in a generation. Citizens decorated streets with fresh flowers. Musicians rehearsed traditional melodies once thought forgotten, and families traveled from distant villages hoping to witness the historic celebration. Standing upon the palace balcony beneath the golden light of sunset, Emily watched the kingdom preparing not simply to honor a princess, but to celebrate the return of truth itself. Beside her, Ethan smiled as the first lanterns illuminated the capital below, knowing that the final chapter of one extraordinary journey was about to become the beginning of an entirely new future for Blackwood Kingdom. The long-awaited day arrived beneath a brilliant blue sky as the bells of Blackwood Kingdom rang across every village, mountain valley, and quiet riverside town. Citizens gathered along the streets leading to Blackwood Palace carrying fresh flowers, waving royal banners, and sharing stories that many believed they would never witness during their lifetime. For more than 20 years, the kingdom had remembered a princess who had vanished into history, and now they stood together to welcome her home. Inside the palace, Emily stood quietly before the tall windows of the restored royal chamber, where sunlight reflected gently across the silver pendant that had guided every step of her extraordinary journey. Eleanor Brooks carefully adjusted the elegant ivory cloak resting upon Emily's shoulders before smiling through grateful tears. "Your mother always believed kindness would find its way back to this family," she whispered. "Today, I believe she was right." Emily embraced the woman who had become both a guardian of memories and a source of unwavering comfort. "Thank you for never allowing the truth to disappear," she answered softly. Outside, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood waited in the royal courtyard where members of the royal council, respected village elders, military leaders, palace staff, and thousands of grateful citizens filled every available space. When Emily stepped into the courtyard beside Ethan, a peaceful silence settled across the gathering before warm applause slowly echoed throughout the palace grounds. Ethan raised his hand, inviting the crowd to share in the moment rather than simply observe it. Today, he said with calm conviction, Blackwood Kingdom celebrates more than the return of its lost princess. Today we celebrate the triumph of truth over fear, hope over silence, and compassion over ambition. Our history has been restored because ordinary people chose loyalty, courage, and love when those choices demanded sacrifice. He then turned toward Emily and respectfully presented the restored royal crest that had once belonged to Queen Isabella. Emily accepted it with both hands before looking across the countless faces gathered before her. She saw children smiling beside their parents, elderly citizens wiping away quiet tears, and friends embracing one another beneath banners moving gently in the spring breeze. For many years, Emily began, I searched for my identity without realizing that so many people had protected it with extraordinary courage. I stand here today not because I walked this path alone, but because faithful hearts refused to let the truth be forgotten. My greatest wish is that every child in this kingdom grows up believing that kindness is stronger than fear, honesty is stronger than silence, and hope is never truly lost. The crowd answered with heartfelt applause that echoed across the palace gardens and beyond the city walls. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Emily walked together through the peaceful royal gardens where their remarkable journey had truly begun. The ancient oak trees, blooming lilies, marble fountains, and quiet stone pathways no longer carried unanswered questions. They had become living reminders that even the deepest mysteries could be overcome through patience, wisdom, and compassion. Emily paused beside the same flower garden where she had first hummed the forgotten lullaby. Closing her eyes briefly, she smiled as the melody returned once again, no longer as a fragment of a forgotten past, but as a cherished memory she fully understood. Ethan looked toward the bright horizon stretching beyond the palace walls. The kingdom has recovered its princess, he said warmly. Emily nodded with peaceful confidence. And I have recovered my family, my history, and my home. Together they continued walking beneath the golden afternoon sunlight, while the bells of Blackwood Kingdom rang joyfully across the land, reminding every generation that truth may sometimes be hidden by time, but it always finds its way back to those who never stop believing in it.